Have you ever heard the phrase muscle memory? What do people even mean by that? Because it's not like your muscles store memories, or at least in the way that we think of memories. Maybe you've also heard people say, don't worry, it's like riding a bike. And this is referencing muscle memory as once you've learned a skill, apparently you never fully forget it. But then people in the fitness world will often refer to muscle memory a bit differently, as once you've gained a certain level of muscular size and strength, if you were to take some time off from working out and lose some of that size and strength, due to muscle memory, you could gain it back much more quickly than you did in the first place. So today, we're gonna figure out what is actually going on in each one of these scenarios by looking at some of my favorite structures in the brain, as well as by looking at what is going on inside the muscles to see if they can store some type of information that also contributes to muscle memory. It's going to be a memorable one. So let's jump into this anatomical awesomeness. So let's start with the brain and how it contributes to muscle memory. And we're going to focus on two areas of the brain. One is this area here, referred to as the motor cortex. And the second is my favorite structure of the brain, and that is the cerebellum. I mean, just look at how beautifully amazing this structure is. And if I show you the other half of the brain, and you look at the medial or the inside surface of the cerebellum, it's equally as beautiful. And this area that kind of looks like branches of a tree is called the arbor vitae, which actually refers to the tree of life. But we'll come back to the cerebellum in just a second. And again, this fold is the motor cortex. And a fold of the brain is just referred to as a gyrus. And admittedly, when I was a student and first looked at the brain, I was like, how do you know what the motor cortex is? There's folds everywhere. Well, if you look closely, you can see this crack or groove going from the top all the way down to the temporal lobe. And this prominent groove on the lateral side of the brain is called the central sulcus. And just in front of this groove is that motor cortex. Now, when you decide to engage a muscle, maybe you're going to start walking, ride a bike, or lift a weight. That signal will come from the motor cortex, travel down the spinal cord, and eventually down to a skeletal muscle, causing it to contract. But before that signal makes it down to the spinal cord and to the muscle, the cerebellum has a few things to say about this. One of the main functions of the cerebellum is to evaluate how well movements initiated by that motor cortex are being carried out. When these movements are not being carried out correctly, the cerebellum detects this and any discrepancies, and then sends an inhibitory signal back to the motor cortex to help correct any errors in those skeletal muscle contractions. Essentially, we need all the muscles involved in the movement to contract and relax at the appropriate times. And so the cerebellum smooths the movements and allows you to complete coordinated and complex sequences of skeletal muscle contractions. But what's interesting about this is that the cerebellum didn't know how to do this just from the beginning. It learned how to do this through repetition. Now, all of us tend to learn very similar movements. We all learn to walk, we all learn to talk, we learn to write. But not all of us learn how to play the piano or the guitar. Not all of us play specific sports. And so what is incredible about the cerebellum is that as you practice certain movements over and over and over again, the cerebellum will start to coordinate these movements at a subconscious level. And the movements start to feel as though they just come naturally, and we don't have to think about or worry about contracting our muscles when we walk. We just decide to walk and the cerebellum does the rest. Some of you have practiced a musical instrument and can have a full conversation with somebody while playing that instrument, assuming it's not a wind instrument. But this also can be applied to resistance training, especially for beginners. One of the adaptations that allows someone to lift more weight or even improve in a vertical jump or sprint speed is simply just learning and getting more coordinated with the movements. So as one's cerebellum learns and gets better at coordinating the movement patterns of the squat, a deadlift, or a vertical jump, they will be able to lift more weight and jump higher in the case of the vertical jump. Now, obviously, there are other adaptations that contribute to one's increase in strength, size, speed, and explosive power, like adaptations within the actual skeletal muscles, which we're going to talk about in just a second, and even another nervous system adaptation where the nervous system learns to recruit more motor units and therefore more muscle fibers on demand. And while we're talking about the nervous system coordinating movements and recruiting muscle fibers, I do want to mention that how your nervous system and muscle fibers create action potentials or send these electrical signals that ultimately leads to muscle contractions is through the use of electrolytes like sodium and potassium. So I do want to take a second to say thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Element. Element is a zero sugar electrolyte drink mix and sparkling electrolyte water. Each stick pack delivers a meaningful dose of electrolytes, free of sugar, artificial colors, or any other unnecessary ingredients. And for those of you who followed our channel for a while now, you may know that I love to play basketball. I play on Tuesdays for 2 hours, Saturdays for 3 hours, and on the other days, I love training to compete in endurance races like Spartans. And these often can take 2 to 3 hours in extremely hot weather. And someone can lose over 2 liters of water and 1.5 to 3 grams of sodium per hour from sweating during high intensity exercise, especially in hot and humid conditions. And imagine if that goes on for 2 to 3 hours. So I have actually experimented a lot with different electrolyte drinks and mixtures in order to replenish my water and electrolytes. And I really like Element. Not only does it do a great job replenishing electrolytes and helping with overall hydration, like I said earlier, it doesn't contain any extra additives, plus it tastes great, to the point where my family members are stealing them. So if you're interested, you can try this risk-free, and if you don't like it, Element will refund your order, no questions asked. So you may as well get your free Element sample pack with any purchase by going to drinklmnt.com/humananatomy. That information and the link will also be in the description below. But let's bring this back full circle, because pretty much everything we have talked about so far is how your muscle memory is developed neurologically, developing and reinforcing those pathways in the cerebellum through repetition. And many of you have likely noticed that if you've taken some time off from a specific motor skill and then you come back to it months later, and in some cases even years later, you don't start from square one. It seems to come back pretty quickly in some cases. Like if some of you have taken an extended time away from riding a bike and then you first get on that bike, you might initially feel like, uh-oh, do I even remember how to do this? But then as you start getting going and pedaling, you start to think, oh yeah, I can do this. I remember how to do this. Or maybe you took some time off from a sport, but then you started playing again and you notice that those skills come back relatively quickly. And even with certain aspects of resistance training, part of the speed at which you regain strength can be attributed to reawakening those coordinated cerebellar pathways. But I would also argue that your nervous system has some memory of how to recruit those motor units more effectively, which also contributes to the quicker return of strength. But what about within the actual skeletal muscles? Is there some ability for the muscles themselves to store some type of information that we could kind of consider a memory? Well, in a way, yes. And this comes from one of the many cool features of skeletal muscle fibers. Most of you from biology class probably remember the nucleus, and you learned that the nucleus contained DNA, all that genetic information. And so the nucleus is often referred to as the command center of the cell. Now, most cells in the human body contain only one nucleus. However, there are a handful of cells that are multinucleated, meaning they contain more than one nucleus, and skeletal muscle fibers, or skeletal muscle cells, are multinucleated, which in a way kind of makes sense. These are huge cells when you compare them to the size of other cells throughout the body. They can be multiple inches long and have a much greater diameter than the typical cell. So again, in a way, it might make sense to have multiple command centers or nuclei to take care of that much real estate. But one of the main reasons why it is good for skeletal muscle fibers to be multinucleated is because they are so active with protein synthesis. And the nucleus directs protein synthesis. When you exercise, certain genes get turned on and expressed that code for making more proteins for the skeletal muscle fiber. And protein synthesis contributes to increases in strength and size. But something else that also tends to happen when muscles increase in their size and strength is that the muscle fiber will develop more nuclei, which can make protein synthesis and maintenance of the muscle fiber even more efficient. But what happens when somebody detrains or takes an extended period of time away from resistance training? Well, we definitely know that strength levels go down and even muscular size will decrease, or in other words, the muscle starts to atrophy. And so you might think, oh, well, we'll probably lose those extra nuclei as well. However, there are multiple studies that have demonstrated that the nuclei will remain even in a detrained state or when the muscle atrophies. So one of the theories behind muscle memory within the actual muscle, again, this isn't an actual memory like we store in our brain, but the fact that the nuclei remain makes it so the muscle fiber may be able to regain its strength and size more quickly through the ability to have more effective protein synthesis when that exercise stimulus returns. Now, there does need to be some more research on this. For example, is there an exact timetable? Meaning, do all these nuclei that were developed from the initial strength training remain indefinitely? Or is there some time period like months or years or some level of atrophy where those extra nuclei will no longer be maintained? Either way, it's generally recommended that you don't test this out on yourself and try to minimize the amount of time you go without exercise and strength training. And as always, thank you for watching and supporting the channel, everyone. Hopefully you learned some useful information about muscle memory. If you don't mind, like and subscribe, leave some comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.